Lauren and her husband were simply trying to get home when their lives took an unexpected and terrifying turn. What began as an ordinary evening spiraled into an encounter they never could have imagined. Stay with us until the end. You won't believe what happened. If you stand against injustice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. The day had been long and Lauren felt exhaustion with every step as she made her way home. The city skyline glowed faintly in the fading light of the setting sun, a warm golden hue stretching over the streets. Wanting to cut her commute short, she decided to take a less traveled route through a quieter part of town. Though dimly lit and scattered with road construction, she had used this shortcut before and felt confident it would save her time. Her husband, the state governor, was waiting at home, and Lauren was eager to unwind after a demanding day. The thought of a quiet evening with him was the only thing on her mind. Lauren had always been a woman of resilience. As a black woman, she had faced more than her share of challenges, but she carried herself with an unshakable grace and quiet strength. Though she was no stranger to the judgmental stares or whispered comments that sometimes followed her, she never allowed them to deter her. Tonight, however, her thoughts were far from those concerns. She was focused solely on getting home, unaware that her peaceful routine was about to be shattered. As she passed by the local fire station, she noticed a group of firefighters gathered around a fire truck, laughing and exchanging jokes after what appeared to be an evening drill. Ordinarily, Lauren wouldn't have given the scene a second glance, but she became aware of a few of the men watching her as she walked past. The looks they gave her weren't casual, their gazes were sharp, laced with a troubling blend of arrogance and disdain. Lauren felt a prickle of unease creep into her chest, though she kept her stride steady. One of the firefighters, a tall man with a rough exterior, detached himself from the group and stepped into her path. Lauren slowed her pace, her polite smile fading as she assessed the situation. "Hey there," the man called out, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "You look a little lost. Not sure this is the best place for someone like you to be wandering around at night." Lauren maintained her composure, offering a curt nod. "Thank you, but I'm not lost. Just heading home." The man chuckled, glancing back at his friends, who were now watching the exchange with smirks of amusement. Is that so? Well, it seems like you might need a little help finding your way." Before Lauren could respond, 2 more firefighters joined him, their stance effectively blocking her path. A wave of unease surged through her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I appreciate the concern," she said evenly, her tone steady but firm, "but I know where I'm going." One of the men, younger and with a mocking grin, sneered as he leaned closer. "Are you sure? You look pretty out of place here. Maybe we should give you a hand." Her fingers closed on the handle as she expected the fist to come down. His invasive gaze sent a shiver down Lauren's spine. She stepped back slightly, her pulse quickening. Though she wasn't one to back down, she could sense the volatile energy emanating from the group. These were men accustomed to authority, men who wore their uniforms as a badge of power. Yet here, in this moment, they were twisting that power into something dark. "I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice firm yet polite. "Just let me pass, and I'll be on my way." Her words, however, seemed to amuse them further. One of the men laughed, a sound cold and dismissive. "Trouble? Oh, we're just being friendly," he said, exchanging glances with the others. They inched closer, their casual demeanor masking an undertone of menace. Lauren clenched her fists, the space around her growing tighter. It was clear they had no intention of letting her leave without a confrontation. One of the men reached out as if to grab her arm, but Lauren instinctively stepped back, her voice rising slightly. "Please, back off. I don't want to have to call for help." Her statement only seemed to provoke them. The first firefighter narrowed his eyes, irritation flashing across his face. "Help," he scoffed. "Who's going to help you here?" As he spoke, he picked up a heavy fire hose lying nearby, holding it up with a grin that sent a wave of dread through Lauren. The others watched with anticipation, their amusement barely concealed. Slowly the man uncoiled the hose, glancing at his friends who laughed approvingly. "Relax," he sneered. "It's just a little water." Without further warning, he released a powerful jet of cold water directly at Lauren. The force of the stream hit her with such intensity that she staggered back, barely managing to keep her balance. The freezing jet of water struck Lauren with brutal force, drenching her from head to toe, and sending a shock through her entire body. She gasped, struggling to shield herself from the relentless torrent, but the firefighter showed no intention of stopping. The others cheered him on, their laughter piercing her ears as the icy spray continued to batter her. The pressure from the hose was overwhelming, forcing her to stumble backward on the slick pavement. She fought desperately to keep her footing, but the relentless force was too much. Within moments, her legs gave way and she crashed to the ground, the impact jolting through her body. The freezing water continued to pour over her, pinning her in place as she raised her arms in a futile attempt to shield her face. Humiliation mingled with pain as the cold seeped into her bones. Every inch of her clothing clung to her skin, soaked and heavy, amplifying the discomfort. The roar of the water drowned out her thoughts, while the cruel laughter of the men echoed around her, turning her suffering into their twisted source of amusement. "Stop! Please, stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking as she struggled to be heard over the deafening spray. But her pleas only seemed to heighten their delight. They showed no mercy, reveling in her helplessness. For a brief moment, a wave of despair threatened to overtake her. She had faced many challenges in her life, but this was different. This wasn't just a physical assault. It was the sheer cruelty, the blatant disregard for her humanity that struck her to her core. Despite the humiliation and pain, Lauren clung to a small flicker of hope. She refused to let them rob her of her dignity. If she could just endure a little longer, perhaps someone would intervene. As she closed her eyes against the torrent of water, she silently prayed that this nightmare wouldn't go unanswered. Lying on the cold, unforgiving pavement, Lauren gasped for air, her body trembling from the relentless assault. Her clothes, soaked and clinging to her, made every movement a struggle. Around her, the firefighters' laughter continued, sharp and callous, amplifying her sense of helplessness. "Look at her," one of them sneered, his voice dripping with mockery, crawling away like a drowned rat. Summoning every ounce of strength, Lauren forced herself to her feet. Her knees and palms burned from scrapes against the rough pavement, but she refused to stay down. She lifted her head, meeting their gazes with a steady resolve despite the pounding of her heart. "I just want to leave," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "Let me pass." Her words, instead of eliciting empathy, only emboldened the men. The firefighter who had first blocked her path stepped forward, a twisted grin on his face as he gestured toward the hose, still dripping onto the ground. "Leave?" he repeated mockingly. "We're just getting started." Lauren stepped back cautiously, her eyes darting between them as she tried to gauge their next move. Part of her wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but another part, the part of her that had endured a lifetime of challenges, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. She squared her shoulders, refusing to back down. Her defiance seemed to irritate the man, his grin faded, replaced by a menacing glare. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he spat. "Let's see just how tough you really are." Without warning, he turned the hose back on, unleashing another powerful stream of water. Lauren tried to brace herself, but the force was too much. The icy blast knocked her off balance, sending her sprawling onto the wet pavement once again. The rough surface scraped her hands as she landed, but the pain was nothing compared to the cold water battering her body. "Stop it," she yelled, her voice barely audible over the roaring spray. "Please, I just want to go home." Her cries were drowned out by the mocking jeers of the firefighters. One of them, a younger man with a cruel smirk, stepped closer, leaning down as if to taunt her further. "What's wrong?" he sneered. "Can't handle a little water?" Lauren's pulse quickened, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way out of this nightmare. As Lauren looked up at the younger firefighter, her instincts screamed at her to fight back, but she held herself in check. She could feel anger and frustration bubbling within, but she knew any retaliation would only escalate the situation. In this moment they held all the power, and they were reveling in it. "Just let me leave," she said, her voice steadier this time. "There's no reason for this." "Oh, but there is," the first firefighter said, his tone laced with cruelty. "We need to teach you a lesson, lady, walking around here like you own the place." Lauren's brow furrowed as confusion joined her unease. "I'm just walking home," she replied. "What harm am I doing to any of you?" Her attempt to appeal to their reason only seemed to stoke their hostility. The younger firefighter sneered, nudging his friend with a smirk. "She doesn't get it, does she? Some people just don't know their place. A chill ran down Lauren's spine, one that had nothing to do with the icy water soaking her clothes. There was a sinister undertone to his words, one that turned her stomach. This wasn't random cruelty, it was about power, control, and their need to assert dominance over her. Without warning, the firefighter tightened his grip on the hose, sending another brutal blast of water directly at her chest. The impact stole her breath and forced her backward, her vision blurring as she stumbled, fighting to stay on her feet. Had enough, he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. Lauren gasped for air, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to shield her body from the onslaught. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible, carried away by the roar of the water. But there was no trace of compassion in their eyes. Instead, her pleas seemed to fuel their sadistic glee. "He's just a little entertainment," another firefighter commented, standing back with his arms crossed, a smirk curling his lips. "Maybe next time she'll think twice before strutting around here like she's better than the rest of us." The words cut into Lauren like a blade. She wasn't trying to prove anything or challenge anyone. All she wanted was to get home, to see her husband, to leave this nightmare behind. Yet here she was, surrounded by men who took pleasure in her humiliation, men who seemed to view her very existence as an offense. As she struggled to stand, the firefighter holding the hose stepped closer, his grin more sinister than ever. "One more time, sweetheart," he sneered, raising the hose, preparing to knock her down again. Lauren's heart raced, fear and defiance warring within her. She knew she couldn't take much more, but she also refused to let them see her break. Squaring her shoulders, she met his gaze, her expression steady and unyielding. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Before he could unleash another torrent, a commanding voice rang out, cutting through the scene with sharp authority. "That's enough." The firefighters froze, turning to see a tall man striding toward them, his expression thunderous with rage. Lauren's heart surged with relief as she recognized him. Her husband. He had found her, just when she needed him most. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice cold and unyielding. "Step away from her. Now." The firefighters exchanged uncertain glances, their smug expressions faltering. The man holding the hose scoffed, his disdain evident. "Who do you think you are to tell us what to do?" he sneered. "This doesn't concern you." Lauren's husband moved closer, his posture resolute, his gaze piercing. "It does concern me," he said firmly. "That's my wife you're assaulting, and I'm telling you to back off." The men exchanged glances again, this time with more amusement than hesitation. One of them chuckled, shaking his head. "Your wife? And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Fixing them with a steady glare, he replied, "I'm the governor of this state, and I demand that you stop this immediately." The declaration landed like a thunderclap, momentarily silencing the group. Disbelief flickered across their faces before the man with the hose burst into laughter, his voice harsh and mocking. "Governor?" he repeated, his tone dripping with scorn. "A black man? Governor? Nice try, buddy. We're not falling for that." Lauren's husband's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides, his voice dropped, deadly serious. "I'm not asking, stand down now or face the consequences." But instead of heeding his warning, the men's laughter grew louder, their contempt deepening. One of them stepped forward, his grin sharp and menacing. "Oh, we'll show you consequences." One of the firefighters sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. "Think you can just walk in here and start giving orders?" With that, he turned the hose toward Lauren's husband, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Before he could react, a powerful jet of water slammed into his chest, sending him staggering backward. "No!" Lauren cried out, her heart sinking as she watched her husband struggle against the relentless force. He tried to steady himself, but the sheer pressure was too much, knocking him down onto the pavement beside her. The firefighters burst into laughter, their taunts cutting through the air. "Didn't anyone teach you not to lie?" one of them jeered, aiming the hose at him again. "Guess we'll have to teach you a lesson too." Her husband braced himself, raising his arms in an attempt to shield his body, but the icy water kept coming. Each blast was harsher than the last, soaking him to the bone and leaving him shivering. Lauren's heart broke as she watched him endure the same humiliation she had faced, the men showing no sign of stopping. They reveled in their cruelty, their laughter and insults, a twisted backdrop to the assault. The attack seemed endless, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, the firefighter holding the hose stepped forward, lowering it with a smirk. "Let that be a lesson to both of you," he said, his voice dripping with derision. "Know your place." The men turned away, their laughter fading as they moved back toward their group. Lauren and her husband remained on the cold, wet pavement, drenched and shivering. Every muscle in her body ached, her soaked clothes clinging uncomfortably to her skin. Beside her, her husband lay slumped, his usual strong and composed figure reduced by the sheer cruelty of men who saw them as nothing more than targets for their twisted amusement. She glanced at him, sorrow and anger mixing in her chest. His chest rose and fell as he tried to catch his breath, his face etched with pain and exhaustion. Yet even in his battered state, his gaze was steady, meeting hers with silent determination. In that moment, an unspoken vow passed between them. This would not be forgotten, and justice would be served. Before they could recover, the firefighters exchanged smug glances and moved back toward them. The ringleader, the same man who had first grabbed the hose, loomed over them with a cruel grin, the hose still in his hands. "What's the matter?" he taunted, his voice thick with mockery. "Governor's looking a little under the weather." Lauren's husband stirred, forcing himself upright despite the pain. Every movement seemed to take immense effort, but he didn't falter. He raised his head and met the firefighter's eyes, his voice calm yet firm. "This will have consequences," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a promise. "You're digging your own graves." The firefighters erupted into laughter, their derision louder than ever. "Consequences," one of them echoed, sneering. "You think anyone's going to care about a couple of liars?" Lauren's fists clenched, anger surging through her veins. She wanted to shout, to fight back, but she held herself in check. She had already seen how far these men were willing to go, and provoking them further could make an already dire situation worse. The lead firefighter smirked, nudging his companions. "Look at them," he sneered, "all high and mighty, thinking they're special. Newsflash, you're nobody here." He raised the hose again, pointing it at Lauren and her husband, his finger hovering over the nozzle. Lauren's heart pounded as she saw the malice gleaming in his eyes. She braced herself, knowing he wouldn't hesitate to unleash another torrent. Without warning, the water surged again, striking both of them with punishing force. The icy spray hit Lauren like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs as she struggled to shield herself. The pressure stung her skin and left her gasping for breath. Beside her, her husband tried to hold his ground, but the relentless stream knocked him back, sending him sprawling onto the wet pavement. He groaned, attempting to rise, but another powerful blast sent him crashing down again, landing hard on his side. The firefighters roared with laughter, their voices dripping with cruel delight as they watched Lauren and her husband struggle against the unrelenting force of the water. Lauren's vision blurred from the icy spray and the sheer pressure, but she could still make out their faces, expressions twisted with satisfaction as they reveled in their victim's suffering. "Is that all you've got, Governor?" one of them mocked, his tone cutting and full of derision. "Where's all that big talk now?" Lauren clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain silent. She knew that any response would only encourage them further. Instead, she focused on enduring, holding on to whatever shreds of strength she had left. She told herself that this torment would end, that someone would intervene to stop the madness. But with every passing second, her hope began to waver. One of the firefighters stepped closer, disdain etched into his features. "You two should have known better than to come around here acting like you're something special," he spat. "You're nothing, just a couple of nobodies who need to be put in their place." Despite the unbearable pain, Lauren's husband lifted his head, his gaze unwavering. His voice, though weak, carried a note of defiance. "You may think that now," he said, "but trust me, this will be the biggest mistake of your lives." The firefighter sneered, unimpressed. "We'll see about that." Without hesitation, he turned the hose back on her husband, the powerful blast of water slamming him onto the pavement with a sickening thud. "No!" Lauren cried, reaching for him, but the water hit her next, forcing her back down. The freezing jet felt like it was crushing her, driving the breath from her lungs. She gasped, her body trembling as the relentless assault continued. The cold seemed to seep into her very bones, and for a moment, it felt as if she was drowning, not in water but in hopelessness. Finally, the lead firefighter signaled for the others to stop. The jet of water slowed and then ceased, leaving Lauren and her husband lying in a pool of cold, muddy water. Every muscle in her body trembled as she tried to catch her breath. Her soaked clothes clung to her skin, amplifying the discomfort as shivers racked her frame. The firefighters stepped back, their smug expressions making it clear they believed their point had been made. "Maybe now you'll think twice before showing your faces around here," one of them sneered. "Consider it a lesson in humility." Lauren's husband forced himself to sit up, his face a mix of pain and unyielding defiance. He fixed the men with a steady glare. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but fierce. "You'll regret this." The firefighters only laughed. One of them crouched down, his eyes glittering with malice. "Go ahead, Governor," he taunted. "Tell whoever you want. No one's going to believe a word you say." With that, they turned and walked away, their laughter echoing as they disappeared into the distance. Lauren felt a wave of despair crash over her. These men would go back to their lives without a second thought, while she and her husband were left to carry the scars, both physical and emotional, of this horrific experience. Turning to her husband, she reached out to help him sit up. His clothes were torn and soaked, his face pale from exhaustion and pain. Yet, even in his battered state, his eyes burned with determination. "We'll make them pay for this," he murmured, his voice quiet but resolute. Lauren nodded, her own resolve solidifying. They couldn't let this go unanswered. They had to fight, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever suffered at the hands of people like these firefighters. Justice had to be served. Yet, as this silent vow formed in her heart, a small voice of doubt crept in. Would anyone believe them? Would anyone care? They were up against a system that had shielded men like these for far too long. Still, she clung to hope. They had to try. As they helped each other to their feet, a small crowd began to gather nearby. People whispered amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of shock and sympathy. A woman stepped forward hesitantly, her expression filled with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with genuine worry. Lauren managed a weak nod. "We'll be fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. The woman studied them, her eyes narrowing as she took in their soaked and battered appearance. "What happened?" she pressed, glancing in the direction the firefighters had gone. Lauren hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal, but her husband spoke up, his voice steady. "We were attacked," he said simply, "and we intend to make sure they're held accountable." The woman nodded, her expression grim. "I saw some of it from across the street," she said. "I know people who'll want to hear about this. Don't worry, you're not alone." Her words brought Lauren a small but much-needed measure of comfort. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt less isolated, reminded that there were still people willing to stand with them. As they began to walk away, still shivering and soaked to the bone, Lauren held on to that thought. They weren't alone, and together, they would fight for justice. Lauren felt a renewed sense of determination coursing through her. This cruelty would not go unanswered. Together, she and her husband would stand against it, fight for what was right, and ensure justice was served. This was just the beginning. Each step they took felt like a monumental effort. Their clothes clung to their battered bodies, soaked and heavy, and the aches of their ordeal gnawed at them. Yet, Lauren gripped her husband's arm tightly, drawing strength from his steady presence. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but she refused to let it overtake her. The humiliation and injustice they had endured were far too grave to ignore. As they reached the main street, curious eyes began to follow them. People whispered among themselves, some casting sympathetic glances while others looked on in confusion. The sheer brutality of the attack was unthinkable, yet the firm grip of her husband's hand reminded Lauren that their fight was far from over. They didn't expect to encounter their tormentors again so soon. As they approached a side street, a group of firefighters emerged, their loud laughter cutting through the quiet night air. The sound made Lauren's stomach tighten. When she recognized the group, a chill ran down her spine. It was them. The same men who had humiliated them so cruelly. Her husband's body tensed beside her, his posture straightening as his eyes locked on the group. The lead firefighter noticed them first, his laughter halting abruptly as a smug smile spread across his face. He nudged one of his companions, whispering something that made the others chuckle. "Well, well," he sneered, stepping forward. "Look who's back for more." Lauren's husband took a deliberate step forward, his jaw tight with suppressed fury. "Enough," he said, his voice low but full of authority. "Your behavior is unacceptable, and you will face the consequences for what you've done." The firefighter raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Consequences?" he repeated mockingly, glancing over his shoulder at his friends, who snickered in response. "You think you're going to give us consequences?" "Yes," her husband said firmly. "I'll see to it that every one of you is held accountable for this." The men erupted in laughter, clearly unconcerned. The lead firefighter shook his head, his steps casual as he closed the distance between them. "You really think you've got that kind of power?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Who are you even supposed to be?" Lauren's husband didn't flinch, his voice was steady and resolute. "I am the governor of this state," he said clearly, meeting the firefighter's gaze without hesitation, "and I will not allow anyone, least of all men like you, to abuse their authority." The laughter died instantly. The men exchanged uneasy glances, disbelief flashing across their faces. The lead firefighter stepped back slightly, his expression hardening as he sized up Lauren's husband. "A black man, governor?" he scoffed, shaking his head with contempt. "Nice try, buddy. You're not fooling us that easily." Her husband exhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not here to fool you," he said coldly. "I'm here to ensure that justice is served." The firefighters exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from disbelief to irritation. The lead firefighter's smirk returned as he raised his hand in a mocking salute. "Justice, huh?" he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Well, Governor, here's a little justice for you." Before either Lauren or her husband could react, one of the firefighters grabbed a hose from the truck and swung it toward them. Lauren instinctively stepped back, her heart pounding, but her husband stood firm, his eyes locked on the man wielding the hose. "Don't," he warned, his tone sharp and icy. "You're only making this worse for yourself." For a moment the firefighter hesitated, his hand hovering over the nozzle. His expression flickered with doubt, but then his face twisted into a sneer. "I don't take orders from you," he spat, and with a swift motion he unleashed a torrent of water. The powerful stream hit Lauren's husband square in the chest, driving him backward with force. Lauren gasped, reaching out desperately for her husband, but the relentless force of the water pinned him to the ground. Her heart ached as she watched him struggle against the onslaught, his face twisted in pain but never yielding. He raised an arm to shield himself, but the merciless spray battered him relentlessly. A second firefighter joined in, turning another hose toward her. Before she could react, the freezing blast struck her, sending her sprawling to the pavement. She hit the ground hard, the cold seeping into her skin and chilling her to the bone as the water drenched her once more. The men's laughter cut through the roaring spray, cruel and taunting. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" one of them sneered, his tone brimming with twisted satisfaction. Lauren clawed at the wet pavement, her hands scraping against its rough surface as she tried to crawl toward her husband. The unrelenting jets of water pummeled them both, each blast more punishing than the last. She saw her husband fighting to stand, his soaked clothes clinging to him, his face etched with pain, but he refused to give in. He pushed against the ground, his hands slipping on the slick surface, only to be forced back by the overpowering spray. One of the firefighters stepped closer, his sneer deepening. "You really thought you could walk in here and boss us around?" he jeered. "You're nothing, understand? Nothing." Her husband, battered but unyielding, managed to lift his head. His gaze, though heavy with pain, was steady and resolute. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low but filled with an unshakable resolve. "You're sealing your own fate." The lead firefighter rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Big words for someone on his knees," he taunted, his tone mocking. "You're not in charge here, we are." He gestured to his companions and they turned their hoses back on the couple. The streams of water merged into a single punishing torrent, pinning them to the ground. Lauren's vision blurred from the sheer force of the spray. Her body trembled as the icy water battered her, each second feeling like an eternity. "Stop it!" she cried, her voice barely audible over the roar of the hoses. "Please, just stop!" But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The men continued their assault, their laughter echoing around them. The cruelty of their actions cut deeper than the physical pain, the humiliation nearly unbearable. Lauren fought to hold on to her composure, to preserve some shred of dignity, but the relentless punishment left her feeling utterly defeated. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the water stopped. The firefighters stepped back, their laughter fading as they surveyed their victims with smug satisfaction. Lauren lay motionless on the ground, her body aching, her spirit weighed down by the humiliation. She turned her head to look at her husband, who lay beside her, equally battered. His face was pale and strained, but his eyes burned with fierce, unbroken resolve. The lead firefighter crouched down, leaning close to her husband's face. "Let that be a lesson to you, Governor," he sneered. "You don't belong here, and if you try to pull any of this again, we'll be waiting." With one last mocking grin, the men turned and walked away, their laughter fading into the night. As the firefighters disappeared into the distance, a surge of anger welled up within Lauren, mingling with the lingering fear and humiliation. Her husband pushed himself up slowly, every movement a struggle, but his expression remained unwavering. He extended a hand to her, and she grasped it, drawing strength from his steady grip. "We're going to make this right," he said, his voice calm yet resolute, despite the tremor of exhaustion. "They think they've won, but they don't know what's coming." Lauren nodded, her own determination hardening. "We won't let them get away with this," she replied, her voice steady and filled with quiet fury. "Not after everything they've done." Together they rose, leaning on each other for support as they began to walk away from the scene of their humiliation. Their bodies were weakened, but their spirits remained unbroken. They would seek justice, no matter how long it took, and they would ensure that those responsible for this cruel act were held accountable. As they disappeared into the night, a few onlookers gathered nearby, their faces a mixture of shock and sympathy. Some pulled out their phones, recording the aftermath, capturing the battered couple as they walked away with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than words. Unbeknownst to Lauren and her husband, those recordings would soon circulate, igniting a firestorm of outrage and setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to justice. But for now they walked in silence, their hearts filled with a shared resolve. They would stand up, they would fight, and they would demand the justice they deserved. This was far from over. Lauren and her husband continued their slow journey down the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. The exhaustion from their ordeal pressed down on them, but the fire of determination burned brighter than ever. They refused to let the cruelty they had endured define them. Instead, it became their driving force, a call to action to ensure justice was served. As they entered a busier part of town, they noticed a crowd beginning to gather, faces filled with shock, curiosity, and concern turned toward them. Lauren felt a twinge of discomfort under their gaze, but straightened her posture, refusing to show any sign of weakness. From the crowd, a young man with a phone in his hand cautiously stepped forward. His expression was one of concern, and his voice was tentative as he spoke. "Are you okay? I saw what happened from down the street," he said. "I recorded some of it. Those men, they went way too far." Lauren exchanged a glance with her husband, a wave of relief washing over her. The young man's footage could be exactly what they needed to hold the firefighters accountable. "Thank you," her husband replied, his voice steady despite his weariness. That recording might be the key to ensuring they face justice. The young man nodded, holding out his phone. "I already called the police," he said, glancing nervously around, as though expecting their arrival. "Someone needs to hear about this, what they did. It's not right." The crowd around them grew larger, murmurs of outrage rippling through the onlookers. Some snapped photos, others began recording videos, capturing Lauren and her husband's drenched and battered appearances. The images and stories began spreading, igniting a wave of sympathy and anger among the gathering. Within minutes, the piercing wail of police sirens cut through the hum of the crowd. Squad cars pulled up, their flashing lights casting an otherworldly glow on the scene. Lauren felt her husband's hand tighten around hers, a grounding reminder of his presence and strength. Officers stepped out of their vehicles, their faces unreadable as they took in the sight before them. One of them, a senior officer with a stern expression, approached Lauren, her husband, and the young man. "Can someone explain what happened here?" the officer asked, his tone firm yet measured. The young man didn't hesitate. "These two were attacked by a group of firefighters," he said, holding up his phone. "I recorded it. They were using hoses on them, laughing, harassing them. It was horrible. They didn't do anything to deserve it." The officer's gaze shifted from the phone to Lauren and her husband, softening as he took in their drenched, disheveled state. "Is this true?" he asked, directing the question to Lauren's husband. "Yes," he replied, his voice calm but resolute despite the exhaustion evident in his eyes. "We were walking, minding our own business. They harassed us, attacked us with hoses, and wouldn't let us leave. It was nothing short of assault." The officer's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll need statements from both of you, and we'll also need to review that video footage." He turned to the young man. "If you're willing to share it, that could be invaluable evidence." "Of course," the young man said, nodding without hesitation. "I'll send it to you right now." The officer motioned for Lauren and her husband to sit on a nearby bench while they processed the situation. Grateful for the chance to rest, they sank onto the bench, leaning into each other for support. As the officers worked, taking statements, reviewing the video, and gathering information, Lauren watched with a cautious sense of hope. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt they were being heard. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, the senior officer returned to them. His expression was resolute. "We've identified the firefighters involved," he informed them. "This is a serious offense, and you have my word that they will be held accountable. We're going to take them in for questioning immediately." Relief washed over Lauren, the crushing weight on her shoulders lifting just slightly. For the first time there was a tangible glimmer of justice, a promise that those men wouldn't walk away without consequences. "Thank you," her husband said, his voice steady and filled with quiet gratitude. "We appreciate everything you're doing to ensure this is handled properly." The officer nodded, his tone softening. "You've been through enough tonight. We'll do everything in our power to make this right." Lauren exchanged a glance with her husband, her exhaustion momentarily eclipsed by a sense of hope. This was just the beginning, but for the first time, they felt they weren't alone in their fight for justice. The officer gave a respectful nod, his voice firm. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable, no matter who you are," he said. "We're here to protect, not to enable cruelty." He turned away, speaking briefly to his team before heading back to a squad car. Meanwhile, the remaining officers stayed close, ensuring Lauren and her husband had everything they needed. They offered medical assistance and asked if the couple wished to provide any additional statements. For the first time that night, Lauren felt a glimmer of hope. The police's willingness to listen and take swift action was a reminder that justice still mattered to some. It was proof that there were people committed to fairness and accountability. As they were escorted to a nearby medical tent set up by paramedics, Lauren's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. She knew the road to full justice would be a long and grueling one. Investigations, interviews, and intense public scrutiny were inevitable, but she was ready. This experience had only solidified her determination to fight not just for herself and her husband, but for anyone who had ever been silenced or wronged by abuse of power. Sitting together in the medical tent, Lauren took her husband's hand in hers. Despite his evident exhaustion, she could feel the same determination she carried burning within him. "We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," she whispered, her voice soft but resolute. He nodded, his gaze steady. "We'll make sure they remember this night for a long time." For the first time since the attack, Lauren felt a sense of peace. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, and she and her husband wouldn't stop until the truth prevailed. As the police secured the scene, Lauren glanced at the onlookers who remained nearby. Some watched silently, while others recorded the aftermath on their phones. In their eyes, she saw empathy and solidarity. They weren't alone in this fight, and that realization gave her strength. Within hours, news of the attack spread like wildfire. Photos and videos captured by bystanders began circulating online, sparking a wave of outrage that quickly swept through the city. The haunting images showed Lauren and her husband, drenched and battered, their clothes clinging to them as firefighters loomed over them, jeering. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Shock and indignation rippled across social media, with thousands demanding accountability. Lauren and her husband's story resonated deeply, drawing comments from people who saw echoes of their own struggles in the couple's ordeal. Personal stories of harassment and abuse of power began surfacing, as others shared how authority had been wielded as a weapon instead of a shield. The day after the incident, local news channels picked up the story. Headlines carried the weight of the injustice with sobering clarity. "Governor and wife assaulted by firefighters," read one. Another headline declared, "Abuse of power. Firefighters attack couple in shocking display of cruelty." Each angle of the story underscored the blatant misuse of authority. The public outcry grew louder, demanding accountability and systemic change. Lauren and her husband spent the morning at the hospital, where doctors conducted thorough examinations to ensure there were no long-term injuries. Lauren bore bruises along her arms and legs from being knocked down repeatedly, and her husband's back was sore from the relentless blasts of water. Despite their physical pain, their spirits remained unshaken, buoyed by the flood of messages pouring in from friends, family, and even strangers offering support. By the afternoon, the governor's office was overwhelmed with calls from journalists seeking statements. Prominent civil rights organizations reached out, offering resources and assistance. It became clear to Lauren and her husband that this was more than just a personal ordeal. It was an opportunity to shine a light on deeper issues within their community. The unchecked power wielded by some could no longer go ignored. The governor's office scheduled a press conference for the following morning. Though naturally a private man, Lauren's husband knew this was a moment to stand up, not just as the governor but as a victim and a representative of those who had been wronged. He spent hours carefully crafting his statement, pouring his heart into every word. It was not only a message of the pain and humiliation they had endured, but also a testament to their resilience and commitment to seeking justice. This wasn't just their story. It was a call to action for everyone who believed in fairness, accountability, and change. The next morning, the press conference was held on the steps of the governor's office. Lauren stood beside her husband, her hand firmly in his, a visible symbol of their unity and strength. Reporters and photographers crowded the space, microphones ready, waiting to capture his every word. Lauren's husband stepped up to the podium, his expression calm and resolute. He took a breath, letting the silence settle before addressing the crowd. "Good morning," he began, his voice strong and commanding. "Yesterday my wife and I experienced an act of cruelty no person should ever endure. We were harassed, humiliated, and attacked by individuals who chose to abuse the authority entrusted to them." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the gravity of his words sinking in. Lauren remained at his side, her posture unwavering as pride filled her heart. "This was more than just an attack on us as individuals," he continued. "It was an attack on the very principles we hold dear: dignity, respect, and equality. When those in positions of authority misuse their power, they not only betray their role but the trust of the people they serve." His words carried weight, the crowd hanging on every syllable. He paused briefly, letting the silence amplify his message before continuing. "We demand justice," he declared, his tone firm and unyielding. "We demand accountability, not just for what happened to us, but for everyone who has ever suffered at the hands of those who think they are above the law. This isn't only about punishment. It's about creating lasting change, ensuring this kind of abuse never happens again." His eyes scanned the crowd, filled with determination. "We will not rest until we see meaningful reforms in the institutions that failed us. We will work with every ally, every community member who believes in justice, to create a future where no one has to walk through their own neighborhood in fear." Lauren squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with emotion. His words weren't just for them, they were for countless others who had faced similar injustices. When he finished, applause erupted, the sound echoing through the steps of the governor's office. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping, but he stepped back, giving a calm nod to signal that more would be addressed in due time. For now, they had said what needed to be said. In the hours following the press conference, Lauren and her husband were overwhelmed by the city's support. Messages flooded in from advocates, community members, and organizations pledging their solidarity. City officials reached out to offer assistance in reform efforts, while civil rights groups began organizing marches and rallies to amplify the urgent need for systemic change within the fire department and beyond. On social media, clips of the press conference went viral. People praised the governor and his wife for their courage and determination. The video from the young man who had recorded the attack continued to spread, shocking millions with its undeniable evidence of abuse. Public outrage only grew, and calls for accountability echoed across every platform. Under immense pressure from the community and undeniable video evidence, the firefighters involved were swiftly suspended pending investigation. A committee was established to review fire department policies and conduct, signaling a growing commitment to reform. Lauren watched these developments with cautious optimism. The swift action brought relief, but she knew it was just the beginning. Temporary suspensions and promises of investigations weren't enough. Real, lasting reform would require persistence, collaboration, and unwavering dedication. She and her husband were ready to lead that fight alongside their community. That evening, they finally allowed themselves a rare moment to breathe. Sitting together in their living room, hands entwined, they reflected on everything they had endured and the long road ahead. "We're not alone in this," Lauren said softly, her voice steady with resolve. "There are so many people out there who believe in the same things we do. We can make a difference." Her husband nodded, his expression solemn but determined. "Yes," he said firmly, "and we will. This is only the beginning." As they sat together, the city continued to buzz with the momentum they had sparked. The outcry showed no signs of fading, and Lauren knew they had ignited something far greater than themselves, a movement for justice that would not be silenced. They had turned their pain into purpose, and with the strength of their community behind them, they were ready to face the fight ahead. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of action and reform. Public demand for justice swelled into a fervent movement as people took to the streets, marching with signs and chanting for accountability. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens joined forces, their voices rising in unison to demand that the firefighters face the full weight of the law. This was no longer just about an isolated incident. It was a rallying cry against abuse of power, unchecked prejudice, and the urgent need for systemic change. Lauren and her husband watched as the story continued to dominate headlines. Each article, every news segment, underscored the impact their ordeal had on the public consciousness. The footage of the attack, paired with the governor's stirring speech, struck a chord that resonated far and wide. Messages of support poured in from all walks of life. People shared their own experiences of injustice, thanking the couple for their courage and their determination to stand against oppression. The legal proceedings against the firefighters progressed swiftly. Video evidence, witness accounts, and the governor's personal testimony left no room for doubt. The firefighters faced charges of assault and abuse of authority, alongside disciplinary actions within the fire department. In court, their once raggedy demeanor was replaced by a stark realization of the consequences they now faced. Lauren and her husband attended every hearing, their presence a steadfast reminder of their commitment to justice. The prosecution's case was clear and irrefutable, with the video evidence standing as an unflinching testament to the firefighters' cruelty. Attempts to downplay their actions were swiftly dismissed, and one by one, the firefighters were convicted, their sentences reflecting the severity of their crimes. But for Lauren and her husband, justice extended far beyond individual punishments. They were determined to ensure that systemic change would prevent such abuse from happening again. Working closely with city officials, they introduced new policies and reforms, starting with mandatory sensitivity training for all firefighters and stricter regulations on the use of force in civilian interactions. The reforms soon spread beyond the fire department. Inspired by the governor's unwavering call for accountability and transparency, other public service institutions adopted similar measures. Lauren's husband continued to advocate for change, organizing forums and town hall meetings where residents could voice concerns, share experiences, and actively shape their community's future. Support from the community was overwhelming. Volunteers offered their time, skills, and resources, while social justice organizations partnered to create coalitions dedicated to lasting reform. Together, they worked tirelessly to build a safer, more equitable environment. Through it all, Lauren remained at her husband's side, her quiet strength a beacon of resilience. She shared her experiences publicly, her unwavering voice encouraging others to stand against injustice in all its forms. Lauren became an inspiration not just as the governor's wife but as a leader in her own right. As months passed, the changes they fought for began to take root. Under new leadership and policies, the fire department shed its toxic culture of impunity, transforming into an institution committed to respect, fairness, and accountability. Lauren and her husband continued to monitor progress, collaborating with community leaders to ensure the reforms remained firmly in place. One evening, as they strolled through their neighborhood, they came across a small group gathered in the park. People were discussing the changes in their community, sharing stories of how the new policies had positively impacted their lives. Some spoke of feeling safer. Others mentioned a renewed trust in public institutions. Listening to these stories, Lauren felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The fight had been long, the journey arduous, but the impact was undeniable. They had turned their pain into a movement for justice, inspiring change that would benefit generations to come. Her husband took her hand, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "We did it," he said softly, gratitude lacing his words. Lauren smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. "Yes," she replied, "and we'll keep doing it. This is only the beginning." Together they stood and watched as the city they loved began to heal, a place where justice was no longer just an abstract idea, but a promise fulfilled. They had endured unimaginable pain, but their courage sparked a movement that changed lives and inspired hope. This story is a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right can make all the difference. Thank you for watching this incredible story of resilience and justice. If this moved you as much as it did us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire change. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how you stand for justice in your own life. See you in the next story.